All right, so this actually is try number 3 of me wrestling with technology to get this to you, but this is a chat about distributed cognition, which we were going to talk about today, but that class got canceled to facilitate people amongst the turmoil trying to move out of the dorms and whatnot. So I'll just chat at you a bit about this topic on this video, and then on Monday we'll have a chance to discuss what questions you have, what observations you have related to this topic. So been going through these different modules. The module that we're currently in is knowledge of self and knowledge of others. And you may have had the thought, well, wait a minute, the social aspect of life doesn't just intersect my life in terms of one-on-one relations with other people. But as we've been discussing it so far, you know, it's only been in those terms. I know you, or you know me, or what have you. But of course, we relate to groups of people. We are members of groups of people and whatnot. So you might have wondered, well, are there any distinctive epistemic angles to any of these kinds of relations, right? Because we don't just have individual relationships. We exist in families. We exist in clubs, majors, schools, nations, tribes, cultures, what have you. Now, eventually we're going to build up to the point next Monday where we talk about whether or not groups can know things, whether they can be the subject of knowledge themselves. But there's various sort of intermediate points between group knowledge and knowledge of other particular sort of people. Distributed cognition is one of those. And you're actually already familiar with lots of cases of distributed cognition, maybe from nature videos. So you see a nature video of a lion that's creeping up on a gazelle. The gazelle gets kind of all tense, right, and ready to run. But that's that dyadic relation, that lion-gazelle relation, is the only thing happening, right? Because the gazelle is a social creature, exists in a herd. And so when that gazelle gets tense, then the gazelles around it get tense. They get disposed. They act like a predator is near, even if they themselves can't see the predator. And then, of course, when the predator makes its rush and the gazelle runs, then that sort of ripples out across the various gazelle, and they all do something. They all run. Similarly, a school of fish will move as one, right, in these sort of cool, intricate sort of patterns that we've seen in nature videos again. But when a dolphin or a barracuda or a swordfish or what have you sort of plunge in there trying to grab a fish, then they sort of break and rejoin, right? And what's happening there is, again, there's a sort of an instinct, a social instinct to maintain a certain kind of normal relation with the other fish around, a sort of a particular, depending on the species and the time of year, a certain kind of distance with other fish, and to maintain alignment. So when one fish breaks because of a predator, the fish next to it, even if it doesn't see the predator, has an instinct to realign. It sees the change in reflectance off the side of the fish next to it, and so it has an instinct to realign at the appropriate distance. And so these forms of sociality, these ways in which one gazelle or fish or whatever is linked to the next one, together allow the whole herd or the whole school of fish to avoid the predator. And the work being done isn't just sort of I, as an individual animal, am doing calculations about how to avoid the predator, but a sort of a form of sociality, a common way of life, and a sort of attunement to others in that way of life is doing the work. This is called quorum sensing. Okay, so do we do that? One area where you might see that is on the freeway. So you're driving down the freeway, all of a sudden you see brake lights, right? And cars are slowing, and you're sort of implicitly sensing that the average distance between the cars, distance between you and the car in front of you, is shrinking, and so you all of a sudden react by driving more cautiously, tapping your own brake lights, what have you, without even necessarily thinking about it. And one of the interesting things about this is, of course, you can get a traffic bottleneck even when there's no accident, right? Even when the initial driver is maybe seeing an accident on the other side of the freeway. And so being natively curious, they slow down a little bit, they look over, right? That changes the distance between them and the cars around them. And so those cars, which also might be curious, are also reacting to the car in front of them, right? So every bit of sort of wave of caution sweeps across the traffic, and all of a sudden, even though there's no obstacle to traffic on your side of the freeway, all of a sudden people are driving as if there were. Okay, so it's not that one person made a decision to cause a bottleneck or something like that, but the sort of local decisions of individual drivers combined with a certain form of sociality, certain form of relating to others, a sort of instinctive alignment, creates a sort of a collective behavior that isn't explained by what's going on in any individual head, but rather what's going on in the individual heads combined with this way of relating. Okay. And as you might tell from the example, there's lots of people who worry about this instinct in us. Maybe they're okay with gazelle acting this way, or ants or bees, or whatever, but they want, us to think on our own 2 feet and act for reasons that we can grasp on our own, this sort of thing. And various ways have been invented to try to sort of harness the epistemic perspectives, the evidence, the information, what have you, of individuals without sort of relying on people to act as a herd, because of course some of our worst behaviors occur in a herd-like manner of average people gripped with fear, say, who riot or lynch or what have you. Okay. Now, the reading that I had you almost do, we're going to skim it for gist, actually, because it's sort of a long reading, but is a famous study by a cultural anthropologist named Edwin Hutchins, where he's studying ship navigation before the digital age. So we had big boats even back then, right? Big boats where no individual can actually see everything that they need to see or keep track of everything that they need to keep track of in order to steer the ship well, especially when you're not just out for a joyride in the open sea, but you're navigating a harbor where you could run aground or run into other ships, or where you have to steer by a very precise course, to get where you're going, or even in battle. So how did we do this before computers? Well, we had teams distributing duties across the team, where each member of the team is reliable about what they're doing, but what they're doing is insufficient on its own to steer the group. But the roles have been constructed so as to intersect in a skillful manner and to build up to the point where the team and in their roles, in their common form of life, with the cognitive tasks distributed across the members, can reliably steer in real time in all these sort of situations. So you have, for instance, say a guy with a telescope on each side of the ship who's tracking, landmarks and things like this, and sort of how quickly the angle changes, angle of view changes relative to the landmark, especially near land, and relaying those to a person up who relates them to a master relayer, relates it to the navigation room, where that information is given, integrated and given to a cartographer who's looking at a very precise sort of map of the known waters, right? And integrated with someone who's taking the barometric sort of readings, who's taking the depth and whatnot, and then giving very precise orders to the person who's steering, who may actually not be able to see anything in some of these old arrangements. Okay. So this cognitive activity is sort of broken up. It's not just in one mind, it's broken up into multiple sort of minds. And some of these people don't even know how what they do factors into the bigger whole. They just know this is my job, this is how I do it, this is how I'm responsible for figuring out, and they sort of pass it along. And the form of life handed to them is sufficient to sort of channel them in the direction of sort of virtuously navigating their context. So Hutchins thought that this was not just a cool artifact of big ships, but rather that this was an insight into how things go for us generally. That in the normal course of things, the economy, for instance, is bigger, has more going on in it than anybody could possibly keep track of. This is one of the things that was the downfall of centrally planned economies like in the Soviet Union with their 5-year plans, and one of the things championed by market-minded sort of folks is this sort of idea that, well, it's too complicated for some even very smart mind to kind of forecast it from some central location to map it all. Like, economists are taking certain indicators, certain data points, which they're dependent on other people to get anyway, and they're, have a simplified model of it or whatnot, but no one actually has an eye on the whole economy. No one actually understands everything going on, and yet we function, right? Maybe we could function even better, but the extent to which, in the normal course of things, goods get where they're supposed to get, they priced in a way where there's not massive amounts of waste and et cetera, is actually coordinating people from all over the world is rather impressive, right? And the economy is just one aspect of our communal life. One could focus on other aspects as well. One particularly interesting case is science. It used to be the case that you could have someone theorizing an area of science from the ground up. Like when the scientific revolution is first starting, the great scientists of the past are making their own instruments, they're doing fundamental theory in interaction with other people, but in a sense they understand their enterprise from the ground up and then are on that basis are doing particular experiments. But science done in that way has severe limitations. And modern science is so big that no one actually has their head around everything going on in science or even any scientific subdiscipline. They're all reliant on what's been done in the past. They're shaped by institutions, cultural institutions, universities, scientific bodies, publishing houses, etc., that sort of influence their norms, values, methods in directions that lead them to interact in some ways rather than other ways, produce some particular kinds of artifacts that can be taken up into the scientific discourse and checked for quality rather than others, to adopt some roles rather than others, to set up their laboratory so as to facilitate certain kinds of interactions rather than others. In a way, it's the same kind of thing. Science is not so much an organized body of propositions that scientists memorize so much as it's a culture that carves up tasks for people, helps them select tasks that will be taken up into forms of interaction that can sort of together make progress, where the whole can make progress superior to any individual part through the virtues of what's going on, the local reliability of the individual scientists, but that has to be taken up into a certain a way of relating to others that makes the whole of science able to make progress. So Ronald Gere would be an example, but then the philosophy of science and the history of science, this idea that the great man of history sort of approach, if it ever was apt, was only apt to a very particular point, and there's a lot of reason to think that actually the normal course of science is by way of distributed cognition. So one of the interesting things to think about then is what's the difference between the good case of distributed cognition, like science, economy when it's going well, and the bad case, or herd instinct, where we act sort of irrationally or in a paranoid sort of fashion. All right, so we'll start Monday with whatever questions people have about that, and there should be a second video coming on tradition-bound rationality in a bit.